This law firm, for a little bit more than the past year and a half, has been privileged to represent a young man by the name of Dontrell Stephens. For more than a year and a half, Dontrell has been confined on a full-time basis to a wheelchair, having been the tragic victim of a close-range shooting by a Palm Beach County Sheriff's deputy. Before I comment on the circumstances that have led to Dontrell's present tragic life, I want to tell you a little bit about the perspective from which I will be making my comments. I started my legal career in 1973 as an assistant state attorney, prosecuting felony cases here locally. And during the next 5 years, the last of which I spent as the chief felony prosecutor, I developed very close relationships with law enforcement. During that period of time, through firsthand experience, I came to appreciate the difficulty of the job that police officers face on a daily basis, attempting to keep the peace on the streets in this community. I came to appreciate the reality of the risks they face, risks that include the risks of death. I prosecuted the shooting death of a local law enforcement officer. And so I understand entirely the need not to judge police officers on the basis of hindsight. I understand entirely the need to give police officers the benefit of reasonable doubts when it comes to judging their conduct, and particularly when it comes to judging their conduct in potentially life-threatening situations. But while it is absolutely essential to give police officers the benefit of reasonable doubts, it is equally essential that when those reasonable doubts are resolved, and they are resolved contrary to the assertions that force has been utilized appropriately and reasonably, then it is also absolutely necessary that law enforcement officers be held responsible for the mistakes they made. It is essential to the community's maintaining its confidence in law enforcement, and it is essential to the performance of other law enforcement officers that they know when they act reasonably, they are going to have the community's support, but they also know when they act unreasonably, they're going to be held responsible for their unreasonable actions. So what's the case that we are here all about today? In September of 2013, Dontrell Stephens got on his bicycle and drove to a local convenience store to purchase an energy drink. Leaving the convenience store, he rode his bicycle right by a parked patrol car occupied by a Palm Beach County deputy sheriff. He rode that bicycle down the street and crossed the street in order to return to the home where he was staying. According to the deputy sheriff, that deputy sheriff first observed Dontrell when he was some 50 yards away, riding his bicycle away from the direction of the police officer. The police officer decided he was going to stop Dontrell, and his stated reason for stopping him was that he had impeded the flow of traffic on the street that he crossed when he rode his bicycle across that street. When pressed as to what that meant, he said that a truck slowed down to allow him to pass in front of it. Dontrell Stephens' crime was causing a truck to slow down as he passed in front of the truck. The police officer pulled out of his parking space. He drove his cruiser down the road. He made the left-hand turn down the side street where Dontrell was pedaling. He accelerated. He turned on his blue light and gave one or two short blasts of his siren. When he turned on his blue light, the constantly operating dash cam camera preserved film beginning 30 seconds prior to activating the blue light. So we have film that shows Dontrell riding down the street. It shows him becoming aware of the fact that he's being followed by a police officer looking over his shoulder. You can see that while riding the bicycle, Dontrell Stephens has held to his ear a telephone on which he is talking, a small black cell phone. When Dontrell becomes aware of the fact that he's being pursued by a police officer, he pulls his bike over to the side, he puts his bike down, he gets off the bike, and he walks in the direction of the police officer and out of view of the dash cam. The police officer is also outside the view of the dash cam. In less than 4 seconds, 4 shots ring out. Dontrell falls back against a wall, still holding his cell phone in his right hand. He falls to the ground. The deputy sheriff comes into view and stands over him, gun drawn, pointing the gun in the direction of Dontrell, ordering him to remove his hands away from his stomach, where he is clutching the wound that has paralyzed him for life. Dontrell was 20 years old. He celebrated his 22nd birthday this past Monday. He will celebrate every birthday in that wheelchair for as long as he lives. His only crime having been impeding the flow of traffic when he crossed the street on his bicycle. Now, I refer to it as a crime, and I refer to it loosely as a crime because obviously it is not criminal conduct. The usual response of a law enforcement officer, if he would ever decide that he was going to intervene under circumstances like that, would be to issue a citation, a notice to appear in court at a later time to answer before a judge, or to pay a nominal fine and avoid the court appearance. For whatever reason, this deputy sheriff decided that something more was necessary, and that something more turned into 4 shots fired at close range.
Can you clarify, you said in the beginning sheriff's deputy, but then you said officer several times. This has nothing to do with West Palm Beach Police. This is all Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Right?
That is correct. And incidentally, I don't mind being interrupted by questions. I welcome the questions. You can save them till the end if you choose, or if the questions arise and you'd prefer to ask them, don't hesitate to do that. But yes, this was a deputy sheriff. He is a law enforcement officer, and I'll probably use those terms interchangeably again, but we are talking about a Palm Beach County deputy sheriff. It's very significant from my perspective to note that this particular deputy sheriff was assigned to what is called community policing. The stated purpose of an officer assigned to community policing is to enlist the cooperation of the local population in keeping the peace. to enlist the cooperation of the local population in keeping the peace. Let me describe to you the way this deputy sheriff was dressed. He was wearing military-style fatigues. He had on a flak jacket. He carried 5 clips of ammunition, 15 rounds in each clip, 1 round chambered in his sidearm, 76 rounds of ammunition, 3 shotgun casings, 5 pairs of handcuffs, a collapsible baton, a taser strapped to his chest, a lapel microphone. In his car, he had a riot shield, he had a grenade launcher, he had the shotgun. This deputy sheriff, charged with the responsibility of enlisting the cooperation of the local population in keeping the peace, was dressed for war. And he has testified under oath that the way in which he dressed and equipped himself was typical of others who have the same assignment within the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. I think it cannot be questioned that when you dress for war, when you equip for war, and when you bring with you out onto the street and into the community an attitude of aggression, you are going to inevitably provoke violence. And you are going to be far more inclined to engage in violence yourself. Part of the problem, part of the very serious societal problem that is dramatically illustrated by this case, is the militarization of local law enforcement. Because this officer is not atypical, and this department is not atypical. Dontrell Stephens was unarmed with anything that could be used as a weapon. He carried in his right hand his cell phone. From the time he is visible on the dash cam video until the time the shots ring out and he falls against the wall to the ground with his cell phone in his right hand. The policies of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office require an officer to walk through a shooting event such as this at the scene. That walkthrough is videotaped. The videotape is available to you. And the story that this officer, this deputy sheriff, tells in that walkthrough, and the same story that he has repeated under oath when he was deposed in the currently pending civil litigation, is that when he stopped Dontrell jumped off his bicycle with both feet on the same side of the bike and appeared to begin to run. Judge for yourselves the credibility of that assertion, because you'll see it on the dash cam video. He claims that he shouted at Dontrell in his loudest command voice that he was to raise his hands and then to get on the ground. He claims that Dontrell ignored those commands. The audio from the dash cam video includes the sounds of the shots and includes no shouted command at all. None. Zero. The officer was wearing a lapel microphone. The lapel microphone is intended to pick up audio from that source and record it to the same retention sources as the dash cam. The officer says that he checked the operation of that lapel microphone very shortly following these events, and it was working properly. But there are no shouted commands picked up on the lapel microphone. The statement that he makes while at the scene is that Dontrell began to back away from him when he was shot. But he also swears under oath that Dontrell bladed him. Blading is law enforcement jargon for narrowing the size of a target. Instead of facing directly at your potential assailant, you turn sideways to narrow the target and to reduce your susceptibility to fatal injury. Deputy Sheriff says that Dontrell bladed him. He reached behind his back with his left hand and pulled out a dark object from his waistband with his left hand and raised it into a shooting position. It was at that point that the officer says, "In fear of my own life, I began to fire." Judge the credibility of those statements yourselves when you look at the dash cam video and see the cell phone held in Dontrell's right hand the entire time. Now, the sworn statements of that police officer go beyond that. He says, "I clearly saw the suspect's hands, and they were both empty. He was not holding anything in his hands. I'm trained," he says, "to observe a suspect's hands. And it's an extremely important part of my training because it is a potential source of danger to me. So I know his hands were empty, but they weren't. They weren't." Those are the statements that he made at the scene. Those are the statements that he has continued to make. And those statements are absolutely and irrefutably false. They are contradicted by evidence that cannot be questioned. This is not a matter of reasonable doubt. This is a matter of absolute, unquestionable proof that this young man was visibly holding a cell phone the entire time, never reached behind his back with his left hand to pull something out, and never should have been shot. Now, it's logical for all of us to sit here and ask ourselves, why would a deputy sheriff shoot under those circumstances? And I will tell you that I am sure that's a question that Dontrell Stephens wakes up asking himself every morning and goes to sleep asking himself every night. It's a question that I have asked myself, and one that I can't answer. I can't tell you why this officer shot Dontrell Stephens, but I can tell you that there was no reason to justify that shooting. Perhaps as he backed away, he thought he was about to run, and he didn't want him to escape, and he fired at him and shot him because he didn't want him to get away after having committed the grievous offense of impeding the flow of traffic on Haverhill Road in West Palm Beach, Florida. I would like to think that this is an extremely unusual aberration. I am compelled to believe that it is far more common that excessive use of force by the increasingly militaristic law enforcement officers who are entrusted with peacekeeping by our communities is far more common than we would ever want it to be. And recent investigative reporting has supported the conclusion that there are far more of these incidents than any community should be willing to tolerate. We've had the dash cam video and the sworn testimony that I have referred to for many months. And we didn't call a press conference. We haven't sought out this focus of attention. And I'll tell you why we haven't done that. We haven't done that because Dontrell Stephens has not wanted West Palm Beach to become Ferguson, Missouri. We don't want West Palm Beach to become another Ferguson. What we want are the kinds of changes in the internal investigations that are conducted of excessive use of force complaints to be meaningful. What we want are independent assessments conducted outside the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, conducted separate and apart from the state attorney's office, because I know about the relationship that exists between the state attorney's office and local law enforcement, and I know that while they operate with the best intentions, the nature of the relationship that exists between a prosecutor's office and local law enforcement is such that a truly independent assessment cannot be conducted. What we want is to have Sheriff Bradshaw, for whom I have a great deal of respect, and who I believe truly thinks that he is doing the right thing. I want him to stop showing up at the scene of every shooting and defending those shootings as justified before any reasonable investigation could possibly have been conducted. And when there are major discrepancies between the account of a law enforcement officer and irrefutable objective evidence, as there is in this case, I want somebody to be asking the right questions. How do you explain this? When the internal affairs investigation officers were deposed in this case and shown the dash cam video, and the discrepancies between the officers' statements and the dash cam video were pointed out to them, their response was, I didn't notice that. I didn't realize that. What law enforcement investigation of a shooting where the shooter was not a law enforcement officer and the victim has survived and is capable of communicating has not included an interview with the victim? How do you possibly stand in front of the community and say, I have reached a conclusion about what happened in this case, and this was a justified shooting, before you've ever heard the victim's side of the story? And Dontrell Stephens was never interviewed by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. No attempt was ever made to speak to him. That is absolutely inexcusable, because it destroys the confidence that we've got to have as a community in those people in whom we entrust the job of keeping the peace. Modern law enforcement traces its roots back to England in 1829 when Robert Peel decided that there needed to be a peacekeeping force in the city of London that was going to be drawn from the community and be part of the community and part of a cooperative effort to keep the peace. The people would police themselves, not through an agency that was imposing order, but through an agency that promoted the kind of cooperative effort that was supposed to be part of what the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office calls its community policing program. Bobbies, Robert Peel, Bob Peel, Bobbies in England, walked the streets and carried nightsticks, unarmed. Now, it was a different time, and it was a different society, and there were different problems that were being addressed, and I don't mean to suggest to anybody that that is an adequate way to equip a modern law enforcement officer. But we have unfortunately moved so far to the extreme end of the militaristic spectrum that the kinds of problems that are being experienced around this nation right now are only going to get worse unless we as a community demand that they get better. I've probably said, I know I've said a whole lot more than I intended to, and I apologize for being as long as I've been, but I would be happy to entertain any questions that anybody might have.
When you were describing the uniform and the police, I mean, isn't he dressed as everybody else, like in your deposition? He had the option of 15 different items in which to put on, and it's not different than anyone else. So you're trying to paint him as if he was a hothead and he wanted to shoot someone? So
No.
Dontrell just gave him the opportunity?
No, to the contrary. What I am suggesting is that the way in which he dressed was indeed typical of the way in which other Palm Beach County deputy sheriffs are dressing, equipping themselves, and it is reflective of the attitude that they bring with them to the job. That's the problem. I am not suggesting to you that this officer was an aberration. Unfortunately, he wasn't an aberration. This is indeed typical. And we've got to think about something else in this regard. Where are these police officers coming from? A lot of them are coming right out of the military. They're coming out of wartime experiences in the Far East, where they have indeed faced extraordinary threats on a daily basis, when every young kid is a potential terrorist bomber. And if you take somebody out of that milieu and you don't re-educate them and retrain them and very, very carefully monitor what they're doing and how they're doing it, there's going to be a transfer of those attitudes to the streets of Palm Beach County. And that's the problem that I see. And I think that it's a very serious problem. I think we need to be consciously aware of the fact that a lot of our law enforcement officers are indeed coming out of that military background. And instead of police administration being aware of and trying to modify that militaristic approach to law enforcement, we have the sheriff standing up at the scenes of shootings talking about the rules of engagement. That's a military term. That's the way in which you interact with the enemy. We're not the enemy. We are your partners in peacekeeping. And unless and until you understand that this needs to be a partnership in peacekeeping and not an adversarial confrontation every time you stop and talk to a young kid who's riding a bicycle on the street, unless and until you understand that, these kinds of problems are going to continue to occur over and over again.
The state attorney's finding letter mentions as a possible explanation for Dontrell reaching behind him, it says that there was a vial of crack cocaine that was found under his shorts that were cut off him by the medics and left on the pavement. An additional baggie of marijuana was found by an ER nurse in his underwear. What is your response to that part of the findings?
There were tests performed on that vial of cocaine, which was very curiously found a substantial time after the scene had been cleared. And there was nothing on that vial of cocaine to tie it to Dontrell Stephens. Nothing. And although there had been a search of Dontrell before he's transported to the hospital, it wasn't until he is in the hospital at a later time that there is alleged to be a small package of marijuana that is found near his shorts, not on him. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Dontrell Stephens never possessed cocaine and never possessed marijuana. What I will tell you is neither of those things is a capital offense. Neither of them is. Neither of them is punishable by permanent paralysis. And does it make any sense that if in fact Dontrell is standing there right in front of a police officer, as heavily armed as this deputy sheriff was, that he's going to attempt to reach behind his back, standing there right in front of the police officer, to take out a small package of marijuana or a small vial of cocaine? That doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe what does make sense is that somebody thought that they were going to try to help a fellow officer. And there were going to be drugs found on the scene to help that officer. Now, did that happen? I can't tell you that happened. It's as speculative to suggest that a law enforcement officer planted those drugs as it is to suggest that Dontrell possessed those drugs. We don't know. They're irrelevant to the issues involved in this case because nobody was going to threaten this deputy sheriff's life with a vial of cocaine or a package of marijuana. That wasn't going to happen. Nor was anybody going to threaten his life with a broken cell phone.
Sir, are you surprised at the reaction that you're getting today, the fact that we have so much national media here, and what does that tell you about the...
I've got to tell you that I am surprised by the volume of the attention. It doesn't surprise me that there is a significant focus on the events of this case. It does surprise me it's taken this long. We've had this video, as I said, for over a year. These events have been the focus of some press attention, but it wasn't until the Palm Beach Post and WPTV decided that they were going to take a closer look at these matters and began to look at the kinds of discrepancies that I've talked about today, that national attention has been focused on this issue. And as I said, these are things that we were reluctant to promote. It wasn't our intention to try this case in the media. We did everything that we could to avoid that. I wrote a very lengthy letter to the Attorney General requesting an investigation. I met with the sheriff and spoke very candidly to him about the concerns that we had and tried to enlist his cooperation. We have tried to resolve the legal issues that will help to provide some reasonable degree of care for Dontrell, as he obviously is going to need for the rest of his life, and all of those efforts have been unsuccessful. So while we have been reluctant to engage in this kind of press conference, it is not a matter of our choice anymore. After the recent local attention, we began to receive requests for interviews from every major news source throughout the country. And The reason why we're holding this press conference today is because I didn't want to spend the next 2 weeks granting individual interviews. And those interviews can't be avoided at this point.
So what's
This is a matter of public concern. We do need to have a dialogue about these issues.
So what's the next step for your client? I understand that Deputy Lynn has been cleared, right? He's not facing any criminal charges. There's this pending civil lawsuit. What's the next step?
We are going to continue the vigorous prosecution of our civil lawsuit. We are going to hope that this focus of public attention begins to be the catalyst for change. It's hard for me to imagine that with this kind of focus, that our officers are just defending themselves, that this was a reasonable use of force, and he wasn't prepared to address any of the inconsistencies between the statements that were made by the deputy sheriff and the irrefutable evidence of the dash cam video. It just wasn't something that he was ready to talk about. I hope that there comes a point in time when he is ready to talk about those things. When he's ready to sit down and explain to the community how it is we can call this a justified shooting in light of objective evidence that demonstrates that at the very least, this police officer acted with gross negligence.
The sheriff has also said that this officer feared for his life. Do you believe that? And is that justification for shooting?
If in fact he feared for his life, he feared for his life unreasonably. And the actions of law enforcement officers need to be judged from the perspective of a reasonable, well-trained officer confronting the same circumstances. The issue isn't, did a particular officer have a subjective fear? Because sometimes people's fears are unjustified and unreasonable. And if Officer Lynn, under the circumstances presented here, was afraid for his life, then he was afraid without justification, and he was afraid unreasonably, and it is reflective of either a serious defect in the training that he received or a serious defect in the attitude that he brought with him to the performance of his job duties.
What's been the response of the Justice Department?
Silence so far.
No changes in the last couple days?
No, not yet. I'm hoping that maybe this will change it.
Did you look into Deputy Lynn's background, and has he had any similar instances of fear for his life in this area? I mean, I hear that this is a high crime area that he polices. You know, is this something that's normal for him? Does he feel like his sense is heightened because of this area? Does that make sense?
The question does make sense. It's a question that I suggest be posed to the sheriff and to Deputy Sheriff Lynn. I will tell you that his personnel files reflect complaints, but nothing that rises to the level of this particular incident. I will also tell you that as a consequence of the focus of public attention on this incident very recently, we have been contacted by others who have claimed to have been the victims of excessive use of force by the same deputy sheriff. Now, I haven't investigated any of those complaints as yet, and that is not unusual. People come forward under circumstances like this for a variety of reasons, and sometimes those reasons are rational, and sometimes those reasons don't have a connection to reality. I can't assess them. I can only tell you that they've been made.
Do you believe race had any role in this?
Unfortunately, yes. I think race did have some involvement in it. It's hard for me to imagine that if there was a young white man who was riding his bicycle in that same neighborhood, wore his hair in a crew cut, dressed in his cargo shorts and his polo shirt. It's hard for me to imagine that that young man ever would have attracted the attention of any law enforcement officer. Dontrell Stephens didn't fit that profile. Dontrell Stephens is black. Dontrell Stephens wore his hair in long dreadlocks. And I don't think there can be any reasonable doubt about the fact that those were contributing factors in the decision to make the stop that was made under the circumstances that it was made.